introduced me to his friends as the lady who lives with us, not his mother-in-law, not Elaine, just the lady who lives with us, the way you'd describe a stray cat that wandered in and never left. I was standing right there when he said it. I had just come down the stairs carrying a fresh pot of tea I'd made for everyone, because that's what I did. I cooked, I cleaned, I made tea at 9 o'clock on a Friday night for a room full of people who had never once asked how I was doing. His friend nodded at me the way you nod at furniture. My daughter didn't look up from her phone. I set the pot down on the counter and went back upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed, the same single bed I'd been sleeping in since I moved into what used to be the sewing room, and I listened to them laugh at something on the television below me. That was when I decided I was done. It hadn't always been like this. Nothing ever starts like this. 3 years ago, when my husband Frank passed, the house we'd shared for 31 years in Barrie suddenly felt enormous. Not in a freeing way, in a hollow way, like a gymnasium nobody uses anymore. Every room had a version of him in it. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug still in the drying rack because I kept washing it out of habit without thinking. The silence after dinner was the worst. We used to do the crossword together. After he was gone, I'd start it and give up after 4 clues. My daughter Colleen called every Sunday. She lived in Mississauga with her husband Kyle and their 2 kids, Brody, who was 9, and the baby, Isla, who had just turned 2. Colleen had gone back to work part-time after Isla was born and was struggling to find reliable childcare. She told me this carefully, the way you lay out a case before making an ask. You'd have your own space, Mum. The basement is fully finished. It has a separate entrance and everything. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, and then I looked around at Frank's reading glasses and the crossword I couldn't finish, and I called her back and said yes. I should say, because I want to be honest about how it started, I should say that for the first month, it was fine, more than fine. Isla was at that age where she would fall asleep in your arms with her whole fist wrapped around your finger, and there is nothing in the world that undoes grief quite like that. I picked Brody up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I made dinner most nights because I liked cooking, and Colleen worked until 6. I felt useful. I felt like I had a place in things again. Kyle was polite in the beginning. He'd say thank you for dinner, though he said it the way you say it to a server at a restaurant, automatic, eyes already elsewhere. He worked in logistics for a company in Brampton, long hours, always on his phone. I told myself he was tired. I made allowances. Colleen had grown into someone I recognized only in flashes. She had Frank's stubbornness and my determination, but somewhere along the way she had also acquired a talent for not seeing what she didn't want to see. She loved Kyle. I understood that. I had loved Frank enough to overlook things too. I told myself this was normal. I told myself I was adjusting. The trouble, when I try to pinpoint it now, started around the 4-month mark. Kyle had friends over one Saturday afternoon. 3 men from work. Loud, easy with each other in the way men are when they feel completely at home. I had made a pot of turkey soup because Brody had been sniffly all week, and soup is what you make. I came upstairs to check if anyone wanted a bowl, and Kyle looked up from the couch and said, without any meanness in his voice, that was the thing, there was no meanness, just carelessness. He said, "Oh, she's always cooking something." One of his friends laughed. I went back downstairs. I told myself it was nothing, a throwaway comment. Men say things like that, but something like that. It plants a seed, and the seed grew. By month 6, I had quietly become the help, not because anyone said it directly, because of the accumulation of small things. The way Kyle would leave dishes in the sink and look surprised if I didn't wash them by morning. The way Colleen stopped saying thank you for dinner, the way you stop saying thank you for something you've come to expect. The way neither of them ever knocked before coming into the basement, because it wasn't really mine. I understood that now. It was their space that I happened to occupy. I want to be clear about why I stayed. People ask that. I've thought about it a lot since. I stayed because of Isla and Brody. I stayed because Colleen was my daughter, and I was not ready to lose her the way I had lost Frank. Not to death, but to estrangement, which felt almost worse because it would be a choice. I stayed because I am 71 years old, and I had spent 50 of those years making things work. And making things work was the only way I knew how to be. I also stayed because I knew something they had apparently forgotten. My name was on the mortgage. This is the part I need to explain clearly because I want you to understand. When Colleen and Kyle bought the house in 2019, they were short on the down payment. The bank required a cosigner with sufficient assets. Frank and I co-signed. We put in $40,000 of our own savings toward that down payment. My name, Elaine Hartwell, is on the title of that property, not as a guest, not as a favor, as a legal owner. Kyle knew this. Colleen knew this. Over time, I think they simply stopped thinking about it. I kept thinking about it. Month 8. This is when things shifted from uncomfortable to something else. Kyle's parents came to visit from Thunder Bay for a long weekend in October. His mother was a sharp woman named Barbara who wore a lot of fleece and opinions. The house had 3 bedrooms. Kyle and Colleen had 1. Brody had 1. Isla had the 3rd, the smallest, which she'd mostly outgrown her crib in. The basement, my space, was, according to Kyle when he mentioned it casually on a Wednesday, going to be needed for his parents. Just for the weekend, Elaine. We figured you could sleep on the pullout in Brody's room. Not a question. A scheduling update. I slept on a pull-out bed in my 9-year-old grandson's room for 3 nights, while Barbara used my bathroom and my shower, and, I noticed, moved my things around on the bathroom shelf. When Kyle's parents left, my bottle of arthritis cream was in the garbage. I said nothing. Colleen, when I mentioned it quietly, said, "Mom, it was just a weekend, let's not make it a thing." I let it not be a thing. But it was a thing. It was absolutely a thing. Somewhere in that period, I stopped eating dinner upstairs with the family most nights. It had grown too uncomfortable, the way Kyle would change the subject when I entered the room, the way Colleen would tense up when I said anything that could be interpreted as criticism, the way Brody had started mimicking the tone his stepfather used with me without knowing what he was doing, because children absorb everything. I made my own dinner downstairs. I ate at my little table by the basement window that looked out at the backyard where Frank and I used to picture having a garden someday. I read. I called my friend Gwen, who'd moved to Victoria 3 years ago and who never once failed to say, "Elaine, you don't have to put up with this, you know." I know, I always said. I didn't do anything about it, not yet. The dinner incident happened on a Thursday in February. I had made a beef and vegetable stew, the recipe my mother used, the one I've made for 50 years, and I brought it up because Brody had asked me to the week before, specifically asked, said, "Grandma, can you make the stew?" So I did. I made enough for everyone. I left it on the stove in the Dutch oven with a note that said it was ready. When I came upstairs to get a glass of water before bed, the Dutch oven was on the counter. Empty. Not empty because they'd eaten it. I could see it when I looked in the garbage. The whole pot poured into a grocery bag and thrown out. A pizza box from a delivery sat open on the counter. Kyle was in the living room watching hockey. The stew was in the pot, I said. I said it quietly. I was genuinely confused. Colleen ordered pizza, he said, not looking up. We didn't want stew tonight. Brody asked me to make it. Kids change their minds. I stood there for a moment. I looked at the garbage bag with the stew my mother had taught me to make, sitting in a Glad bag next to a pizza box. I looked at Kyle watching hockey. I looked at the door to Colleen's office, closed, light on underneath. I washed my hands at the sink. I turned off the kitchen light on my way out of the room. I went downstairs. I did not sleep. By March, I had spoken to a lawyer. Not about anything dramatic. I told myself it was just information. Her name was Susan Chen. She worked out of an office on Ontario Street. She specialized in family property law. I had found her through the Law Society of Ontario's referral service, and I had made the appointment without telling anyone. She was direct and matter-of-fact in the way I have always preferred people to be. "You're on the title," she said, looking at the documents I had brought. "Yes. And they know this." They did. I think they've stopped thinking about it. She looked at me over her glasses. "Do you want to stop thinking about it as well?" I told her I had been thinking about it for 8 months without stopping. I told her about the pull-out bed and Barbara's fleece and my arthritis cream in the garbage and the stew in the Glad bag. I told her about the lady who lives with us. She listened. She wrote things down. When I was finished, she folded her hands on her desk and said, "You have options." The option I chose was not immediate. It wasn't impulsive. I thought about it for 6 more weeks, which I think is important to say. I was not angry anymore by the time I acted. Anger burns itself out. What I had by April was something quieter and harder. I had made a decision. I asked Susan to begin the process of formally asserting my ownership position, filing with the land registry, notifying the mortgage holder of my co-ownership status, and preparing a formal notice to the occupants. In plain language, I was putting my name back on everything that had always had my name on it, and I was asking my daughter and son-in-law, officially and in writing, to either include me in decisions about the property or make arrangements to buy out my share. The formal letter arrived on a Tuesday. I know because I was not home when it was delivered. I had driven to Barrie to spend a few days with my cousin Ruth, who had no idea any of this was happening and who made me tea and asked me about Frank and did not ask me to sleep on a pull-out bed. Colleen called me that same Tuesday evening. I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times. Kyle called once, which surprised me. He hadn't called me directly in the entire time I had lived there. His voicemail was short, and his voice was different from the one he used when I brought up the tea on Friday nights. That voice had been casual, careless. This voice had edges. I called Susan the next morning and asked her what to do next. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. I want to say that because I think people expect a shouting match in the kitchen, doors slamming, years of grievance pouring out in one scene. It didn't happen that way. I have no talent for scenes. Frank used to say I was the most quietly stubborn person he had ever met, and I think he meant it as a compliment. Colleen and I spoke on the phone on a Wednesday evening. She was upset. She said I had blindsided them, that she couldn't believe I would do this to her, that she had thought I was happy there. "Were you happy?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Were you actually paying attention," I said, "to whether I was happy?" She said that wasn't fair. I told her I had slept on a pull-out bed so Kyle's mother could have my bathroom. I told her I had made a stew that ended up in a garbage bag. I told her that her husband had introduced me to his co-workers as the lady who lives with us. I said it all very slowly, not with anger, but with the particular sadness of someone reading back a list they have been keeping for a long time. She was crying by the end. I was not. I had done my crying in September and October and February and on the drive back from Barrie. I was past it. "I didn't know it was that bad," she said. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's most of it, Colleen." I moved out at the end of May into a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-rise near Lakeside Park in Port Credit. The second bedroom is for Brody and Isla when they visit. And they do visit. Brody rides his bike to the lake, and Isla has already made handprints in paint on the wall of her room, which I deliberately have not washed off. The question of the mortgage and my ownership share was settled through the lawyer over the course of several months. I will not go into the details because they are between me and Colleen and the documents, but I will say that my name had always meant something on that paper, and in the end it was treated accordingly. Kyle and I have not spoken since. Colleen and I are careful with each other. There's a scar there, the kind that changes the shape of things even after it heals. We are working on it. Slowly. Some Sundays she calls and it almost sounds like it used to, before the basement and the pull-out bed and the woman who lived with them. I still make the stew. I make it for myself now, and I eat it at my own table, in front of my own window, looking out at the lake. Frank would have found the whole thing very satisfying. He always said I was the most quietly stubborn person he had ever met. He was right. It just took me a little longer than it should have to remember it. I've been thinking about the stew a lot lately, not with bitterness. I'm past that. But because it keeps coming back to me as the clearest image of everything that went wrong in that house. Not the pull-out bed, not Barbara moving my things around, not even the words, "the lady who lives with us," the stew, my mother's recipe, and a Glad bag in the garbage. There's a certain kind of pain that comes not from cruelty, but from indifference. Kyle wasn't a monster. Colleen wasn't a bad person. What they were was careless. Careless in the way people become when they stop paying attention to the cost of things, the cost of someone's time, the cost of someone's dignity, the cost of quietly erasing a person from the space they occupy until she becomes, in everyone's mind, including eventually her own, just the lady who lives with them. I think about the choices I made during those 8 months, and I'm honest enough to say that some of them weren't good ones. I stayed too long. I said nothing when I should have said something. I told myself that accommodation was the same as grace, and it isn't. There's a difference between choosing patience out of wisdom and choosing silence out of fear, and I spent too many months confusing the two. What finally shifted wasn't anger. Anger, I've learned, is like a fire. It burns hot, and then it needs feeding, and eventually you're spending all your energy just keeping it going. What shifted was something quieter, a kind of clarity. I looked at my own name on a legal document and I understood that knowing your worth and acting on it are two entirely separate things, and I had been doing only the first one for far too long. That's the part I think about most now, when I look out at the lake from my own window. Not the confrontation, not the lawyer's office, not the letter that arrived on a Tuesday. I think about the moment I decided to close the gap between what I knew and what I did. That gap between understanding something and having the courage to act on it. That's where so many of us live without realizing it. I lived there for 8 months. Some people live there for years. I am not going to pretend the ending was clean. Colleen and I are still finding our way back to each other. There's a scar, and scars don't disappear. They change the shape of things. But I've also learned that the shape of something can change and still be worth keeping. We're careful with each other now in a way we weren't before. And maybe that carefulness, uncomfortable as it is actually a form of respect that we hadn't managed to build when everything was easier. Frank was right about me being stubborn. He just didn't mention that stubbornness without direction is only half the thing. The other half is knowing when to stop being quiet about what you know, and then doing it anyway, even when it costs you something, especially then.